I just remember that she doesn't really like to sit very front or something like that, so yeah, and I figured. Although, no, no, no.
We almost lived right around. Oh, it's okay.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Tom Nagorski. I'm the Executive Vice President here at the Asia Society. Sorry for the slight delay. Welcome to all of you for a very special edition of our Asia Briefing breakfast program, what we might call the morning after, although I guess technically it's 36 hours after. Be that as it may, as the world continues to digest all the reports and the words and the images we've seen, and now watching Twitter as well, following the remarkable meeting in Singapore. Welcome, before we begin, to Asia Society trustees who are in the room with us today: Frank Brown, Beth Dezoritz, Ambassador Caroline Kennedy, Oscar Tang, and Lulu Wong. Great to have you here, and welcome to all of you here in the room, members of the press. Good to see you, and to our global audience watching the live stream. This morning, given the import of the subject and the great guests we have here, dispensing with the usual podium remarks about upcoming events, you can always find those at asiasociety.org. What we're here to discuss today is really, I think, whatever your point of view, political or otherwise, a remarkable moment or a series of moments over the last 48 hours in history. We have a pair of guests who really are as good as it gets to match that moment. Somebody said here yesterday it's as good as the Sunday morning news programs. I'd venture to say it might be a little bit better because we have a little bit more time. You get to ask your questions. We have no commercials. A reminder for those watching beyond the room, you can send your questions via asiasociety.org. To moderator at asiasociety.org, or via Twitter using the hashtag AsiaSocietyLive. That's also the hashtag for this event. You have bios for the guests this morning. You may know them already, but just some quick words of introduction. Delighted to welcome back to the Asia Society Ambassador Wendy Sherman, who led the team, the American team that negotiated the nuclear deal with Iran, and also served before that as special advisor to President Clinton on North Korea. So she brings really unparalleled expertise and experience to this discussion. She's also one of the few Americans ever to have met Kim Jong-il, the father of the current leader. That was, back in 2000, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And joining Ambassador Sherman with us this morning is our own Danny Russel, former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Also served, among other things, as point person for President Obama on Korea. We really do feel privileged to have you both with us. I said a moment ago before we came in, I just wanted to frame things very briefly because there have been in these first 36 hours, there's quite an interesting range, I think, of comment and commentary that goes from, on the one side, Trump gave away way too much for way too little, to, on the other, give it time, and it really is a historic moment. So just to give you some flavor of that, Ann Applebaum at the Washington Post, the meeting legitimizes Kim Jong-un. It gives Trump a photo op win. Everyone else gets nothing. The historian John Meacham, he actually would quibble with my use of historic. He said, just because something never happened before doesn't make it historic. That requires its results to be significant and enduring. Nick Kristof, at least in the first round, Trump seems to have been bamboozled. On the other side, or just a different point of view, our own Kevin Rudd, Policy Institute president here. His quote, "The summit marks a paradigm shift. Whether it's permanent, only the negotiations in the next round will tell. We should always be skeptical, but we should never allow our skepticism to suffocate the possibility of new progress." He goes on to say President Trump's style is not orthodox, but then again, Trump has never claimed to be a graduate of the Georgetown School of International Diplomacy. And then lastly, Victor Cha, who, as you may know, was slated for a time to be the next U.S. ambassador in Seoul. That got scuttled. He says in a piece this morning, there is a phrase in Korean, begun is half done. Means when tackling a difficult task, half the battle is getting started. Despite the many warts in President Trump's unconventional diplomacy, we have to give him credit. Only 5 months ago, I thought we were headed down an inexorable path toward a devastating war. So, a framework. Ambassador Sherman, let's start with you. What do you make, I guess, not only of what happened in Singapore and what didn't happen?
First of all, it's great to be with you all this morning and to be here with Danny who we worked together during the Obama administration, and great to see you again. And to be here with the Asia Society, which really is tremendously important because most of the world is looking to Asia for the future. Quite frankly, after some of the things that have gone on with our G7 colleagues, I think that Europe is looking more towards Asia these days. We really are at an interesting point, and I don't think we know the end of the story, even though we've watched the beginning. I agree with what you've said, that there are really two schools here, but it's really not a either-or situation. I think that it is good that President Trump met with Kim Jong-un. I supported that meeting, and I supported that meeting because in North Korea, leaders believe that only leaders make decisions, and that's maybe patently obvious because there is no freedom of the press. There's no real press. Videographers follow the leaders around taking photographs and tape. There is no legislature to speak of, and there certainly is no we the people. So it is indeed true that the leader of North Korea, although he has to manage the military, truly is the only one who makes decisions. And we have a president, although we are a democracy, who also believes that only he makes decisions. So I thought that it probably did make sense for these two men who have a certain unfortunate similarity in their approach to decision-making, though, let me be clear, Donald Trump is not a brutal dictator, and Kim Jong-un is a brutal dictator. He got to where he is because he killed his uncle shortly after he got into office, and then killed his half-brother and killed many other people and put thousands of others in gulags and labor camps. So he's not a nice guy. So I think that them getting together was good. What I was surprised about, however, was that the statement that came out of it, that was signed by both leaders with much fanfare, was very thin. And indeed, every document previously has been more. So the 1992 joint declaration between North and South Korea called for the end of all facilities, all programs, inspections. The 2005, September 2005 statement of the six parties in the six-party talks called for verified denuclearization. The agreed framework set up in 1994 set up a parallel reciprocal process that included inspections and knowing what the heck you were doing, even though it was only 3 pages long, in considerable detail. So the statement that came out of this was very thin. So my hope that the leaders would have set a framework and then the negotiating teams could go off and do the hard work, I was rather disappointed. Secondly, I was somewhat concerned, though not surprised, the extent to which the orchestration of the event sought to make Kim Jong-un an equal to the President of the United States. Let's put Donald Trump aside. Whether it's Donald Trump or Barack Obama, there is no way, in my view, that North Korea is the equivalent of the United States of America. Yes, it's another country, horrible country, not one any of us would want to live in. But there were ways you could have orchestrated this that it wasn't quite so giving to a brutal dictator who could go home and say, I've been accepted as a nuclear power, I've been accepted as an equal to the President of the United States, I am dominant on the world stage. And then thirdly, although I believe that the focus of any negotiation should be on the nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, and perhaps chemical and biological weapons, I do think it was critical for the President to raise human rights. When Secretary Albright went to Pyongyang in October of 2000, and that's the trip that I was with her on, and she and I spent 12 hours with Kim Jong-il, the father of the current leader. She brought with her Secretary for Human Rights, Labor and Migration, Harold Koh, because she wanted to make a statement that he was a part of our delegation, very important to our way forward with North Korea, and she wasn't going to mess around about that. And Harold, as it turns out, is a Korean American, I forget which one, but one of his parents came from the North, one of his parents came from the South. So it was a very powerful message. And I think that the president saying that those in the labor camps would be the winners, that this wouldn't have happened except for Otto Warmbier's death, that Kim Jong-un was an honorable, trustworthy man, in my view, are not comments worthy of the President of the United States. And then my last comment, to go back to your initial framing, a friend sent this to me this morning for us all to contemplate. Trump tweeted out the following this morning. Before taking office, people were assuming that we were going to war with North Korea. President Obama said that North Korea was our biggest and most dangerous problem. No longer, sleep well tonight. But here's the second quote from Chamberlain in 1939 after returning from Munich. My good friends, for the second time in our history, a British Prime Minister has returned from Germany bringing peace with honor. I believe it is peace for our time. Go home and get a nice, quiet sleep. I don't think this is where we are, but I think we have to be wary that we not be there.
There's a lot to pick on. I'll come to you in one moment, Danny, but I just want to ask one question as a follow-up, Ambassador Sherman, which is, you said that there are things that could have been different in the choreography to not render them as equals. I mean, obviously we get that he said things that helped put Kim on a pedestal that, but those presumably were not scripted. I mean, but what could have been done in the preparation or the choreography don't you, once you walk into the place and you
Sure.
shake hands, right?
Sure. There's no way to make it perfect, but I have never seen a banner of flags in quite that setup.
There they are.
It would have been fine to have had, someone also tweeted yesterday to me, very un-PC, that when they stood next to each other, it was as if the captains of the elementary school team were down to their last picks. But at any rate, I don't think you had to have that banner of flags in quite that way. You could have had one American flag, one North Korean flag. There's a line between respect and unctuousness and propaganda. And the president's words were, in my view, way over the top. You can't sit across from someone and not give them some measure of respect. If you're going to be in the same room with them, right, it comes with the territory. But I thought that, and I know that the North Koreans in the run-up to this were absolutely adamant that everything be equal, because they knew what they were doing. And the president just played right into that by, I believe, overemphasizing that equalness, which in my view does not exist.
Right, and their press is not surprisingly filled with that today.
Yeah, well, their press is one guy.
Right. By the way, I'd like to know more about that guy who sent you that tweet, or woman, or whomever. That's an interesting one.
But it is an important point, because Nodong Shinmun is filled with the image of Kim Jong-un being treated as a peer by the leader of the free world. That is not an accident. That is a long-term objective, and that is of immeasurable value to North Korea. It provides significant cover for the very nuclear program and the ballistic missile programs, the very behavior that we are trying to reverse and eliminate. In fact, the summit, which I was not, maybe one point in which I don't 100% agree with Wendy, I was not in favor of, in part because there was simply no preparation, and I thought it played right into Kim Jong-un's game plan. The point is that it has served, perhaps beyond what the North Koreans themselves could reasonably have expected, to normalize, if not legitimize, North Korea as it is, which is to say, as a nuclear power. Now, Tom, to go back to your original sort of framing of two different approaches to the problem, I think the distinction we need to make is between cynicism on the one hand and naivete on the other, both of which we have to avoid. Skepticism, however, lies, like science, right in the sweet spot. And it's right and appropriate and proper to be skeptical about what North Korea says, given the long-term history. You know, Victor invoked a great Korean saying. I'll invoke a saying from one of the great American philosophers that Wendy and I both worked with, Tom Pickering, who used to say about diplomacy, you want it bad, you get it bad. And the hunger that the president displayed and the resistance he showed to allowing a preparatory process to really set the stage so that he could come in as the closer, not as the entirety of the U.S. DPRK show, put us at a very big disadvantage. And I think the net result is, in fact, that we got it bad. The U.S. brings or brought tremendous leverage to the negotiations. North Korea brought threats to the game. And I believe that we can see that President Trump left Singapore without leverage, and Kim Jong-un returned to Pyongyang with his ability to threaten the United States intact. I mean, think about what the going-in goals were for both of them. For Kim Jong-un, it was, let's get this bloody-nosed threat off the table. Let's loosen the straitjacket, the stranglehold of sanctions so that I can at least get some breathing space. Let's diminish the pressure to measurably, comprehensively, verifiably, irreversibly denuclearize, and instead shift the focus of discussion to a peace treaty, which just sets the stage for us to continue to define everything the U.S. might do as a hostile policy, as a threat to us, as inconsistent with a peace treaty. Let's see if we can't move the U.S. in the direction of withdrawing troops. Let's end the isolation and pariah status that Kim Jong-un and North Korea face and be feted, if not integrated, into the international system. If that's sort of the shorthand list of top objectives for Kim Jong-un, you got to say he had a pretty good day in Singapore. Conversely, the one thing, to its credit, that the Trump administration has been adamant about is that American objectives and American national security are built on CVID, comprehensive, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization. Now, CVID gets a bad rap. People claim it's too much, it's not realistic. It simply means we're not going to take a partial settlement of North Korea's nuclear program. We're not going to verify, we're not going to take North Korea's word for it. We want to trust but verify. And irreversible means it's not good enough just to have an on-off switch and have him temporarily stand down on the threats. So the scorecard against the backdrop of what the Trump administration said it was out for in Singapore is paltry. There is not 1 gram of fissile material either moving out or likely to move out of North Korea. There's barely a mention and nothing in the joint statement about the ballistic missile threat, which is a key component of the UN Security Council resolutions. So my point is simply, cynicism aside, naivete aside, when you objectively do the arithmetic, this comes out dramatically in Kim Jong-un's favor.
So let me ask something that then, at the risk of diving headfirst into the naivete column, and this is not an arithmetic or scorecard question, but just to take a look back for a moment, and we need to move the conversation obviously to what comes next, but 6 months, a year ago, we had fire and fury, we had actual missiles being lobbed all over the place. Danny, every time we had a private or public conversation, it was about this bloody nose or worse that was coming. And so without going through the whole litany of things, but beginning, I guess, with the Olympic Games and what we've seen over the past few months, as a perhaps hopelessly naive citizen of the planet, I feel a little bit safer than I did, at least about that situation in that part of the world, which is a keep you, again, it's a keep you up at night thing. So am I deluded? Am I foolish to feel this way?
No, I think we are in a better place. There's no question that diplomacy and dialogue are better than fire and fury. And and it's good that there is a moratorium on nuclear tests and missile launches, because every time they do those things, they learn more, their program advances further. So that is a good thing. And you can't discount that. And certainly the markets don't discount that. They're very happy that sort of the threat of going to war is over for the moment. We could be right back there in a nanosecond, though. So there's nothing yet sustainable or durable about where we are. It is good that we are here, but unless there is a way forward, this won't stand forever. You know, some people believe freeze for freeze will get you a very long way. I don't think that's durable over a long period of time, because Kim Jong-un needs to get sanctions lifted to be able to move forward in his vision of turning the corner as the leader of his country. He, in his view, believed he finished the arsenal in November. He traveled to Mount Paktu and climbed to the top of the mountain in dress shoes. So I don't know. But anyway, there were photos of him at the top in dress shoes. And
he's a special man.
Special man. He is a special man. So that is true. So he started months ago to say to the people of North Korea, we are now strong and powerful and have a nuclear deterrent, and we now can turn to improving our economy, creating a better future, because he's a young guy and he wants to stay in power for a very long time. So he has to do that, but he has to do that in a measured, careful way. As Kim Dae-jung understood, if you crack the door open a little bit, from a North Korean point of view, it may open too fast and you lose control. So he's got to be careful how he does this. So I don't think this is durable forever, but certainly it is better than where we could be. I would say two other things. The two folks that I think come out of this the very best, besides Kim, and I agree with Danny in his list of all the things that Kim got, which were pretty substantial. South Korean President Moon Jae-in, really, if there's a Nobel Prize to be given, I'd give it to him, because he was elected to get engagement going, to move forward. He's taken every opportunity to do that, from the Olympics to really mediating to get the summit back on, though I don't believe it was ever really off. But nonetheless, he's really tried to shepherd this forward. And to that extent, I find it stunning that the White House did not tell the South Koreans about stopping the joint exercises beforehand. But then again, this is a president who doesn't believe in allies. So
didn't tell the Pentagon.
Didn't tell the Pentagon. So he doesn't believe in allies. He doesn't believe in the system. He believes in himself and his instincts. And the other big winner out of this, besides Kim and Moon Jae-in, is China, who really, having the joint exercises stopped, is part of China's dream team. And they have Kim Jong-un sort of now poised to last for a while, which is in their interest. So I'd say China's a big winner. And I think Evan Osnos has a New Yorker piece out making that argument.
You know, you mentioned the Olympics, and this may, you know, in such a crazy sequence of events, but it's not too much to think that had those Olympic Games not happened when they did and where they did, and as you say, President Moon doing what he did with the opportunity, we wouldn't be here, right?
I think that's possible, yes.
But Tom, yeah, I mean, let's remember that this sense of relief, the endorphins being released in the bloodstream because we're not being confronted with the imminent threat of fire and fury, is part of North Korea's business model. There's a pattern. Now, there's no question that Kim Jong-un is his own man, and he's a different breed of cat than his father and his grandfather. His tactics are different, but he's operating from roughly the same playbook, which is you create a crisis, you raise the threat, you raise tensions. And if you look through the record of 2017, you see that. And what he found in President Trump was an unprecedented American leader who was prepared to see him, raise him at every step. And so we found ourselves in a race to war that felt uncontrollable and felt, frankly, pretty terrorizing. But engendering that sense of terror in the West is North Korea's business model. It's roughly built around the, say, Gambino family system. And there's a reason that people are willing to pay protection money, that they're willing to pay to rent a little peace and quiet. The problem is, whether it's in law enforcement or geostrategic challenges, is that the price keeps going up. And while we may feel, and we all feel, a sense of relief that Kim Jong-un went from being a lunatic and a dangerous madman to being a very honorable guy in a heartbeat, and that the risk of war seems to have abated, the fundamentals haven't changed at all, except to the extent that North Korea has gained very significant leverage, significant strategic advantage. The ability to break up the solidarity of the five parties, to separate China from the U.S., to separate Japan, South Korea, the United States, which is what he has done, is immensely important as a strategic matter for North Korea. He is negotiating bilaterally, separately, with each of the five countries and has created a race, a competition for his favor that is the opposite of the box that he was in just 6 months ago. So yes, we all feel a sense of relief. Yes, jaw is better than more war, but take a step back, look at it more broadly. Ramping up the tension by North Korea, exploiting, as you point out, the timing of the Olympics by dangling a bit of an olive branch and suggesting, well, maybe I won't blow them up. It was Kim Jong-un in the first place who threatened the Olympics. Creates a dynamic where people will come to his door bringing gifts. And President Trump brought to Singapore, the world's biggest candygram. This is a bonanza for the North Koreans.
Well, okay, so you both mentioned sanctions, and that's the ultimate bonanza or candygram or what have you. There is, I guess, a suggestion, if not the reality, that the Chinese now will, that spigot will reopen, or maybe already has. But there's still leverage there, is there not, in terms of what the United States and its allies can do or not do, in terms of what I would imagine is an ultimate item on Kim's wish list?
Well, I think there's leverage, but I would suspect that the Chinese will open up the spigot. And, even though the Security Council sanctions are good and are part of the pressure that was put on here, China constitutes the lion's share of North Korea's economy. So if China starts to loosen up the sanction spigot, it's going to be very hard to get them back on again. And one of the things that I think that the president doesn't fully appreciate is that sanctions only work if you do work and play well with others, because they're not likely to help you out. The reason in the Iran situation why the sanctions worked so well is that people wanted us to have diplomacy. They wanted to find a peaceful solution, and were willing to take on both the multilateral and our unilateral sanctions while the diplomacy went on. But once the diplomacy was over and everything blew up, they're not anxious to play by our rules so much anymore. Yeah. And one of the things that's important to know about sanctions press people to come to a negotiating table, but they don't stop bad behavior. When the Europeans started negotiating with Iran, they had 164 centrifuges. By the time in 2013 we got to more serious negotiations, they had 19,000 centrifuges. The North Koreans haven't stopped their program. In fact, they did more tests, both nuclear and missile, while the sanctions ramped up. So sanctions are to focus the mind to come to the negotiating table. They don't stop bad behavior.
I think those are incredibly important points. I would add one more, which is that It isn't what sanctions are on the books. It is a question of the extent to which they're being implemented. And implementing sanctions is no fun. It's expensive. It's a diversion for most countries of law enforcement and intelligence resources. It's pretty intangible, and the North Koreans are very good at evading them. I think that maximum pressure, which is something that is in the credit column of the Trump administration, which was really all about getting countries to enforce the sanctions. I think maximum pressure went to minimum pressure pretty much the morning after the announcement in March that President Trump, without any notification, any consultation with allies, was seeking a meeting with Kim Jong-un.
To your earlier point, he was, I think you used the term, he was raising and in the poker game through much of last year. Your Gambino family analogy, I mean, the president was, and he has said this, or his aides have said this many times, you know, they think they brought him to the table because he was not just on sanctions, but was very, very tough with the language, and that had something to do with getting to Singapore in the first place.
I mean, I think the maximum pressure campaign, I agree with Danny. President and the team should get some credit, Nikki Haley, for getting those two Security Council resolutions through. But I think the fundamental reason Kim reached out through the Olympics to do this is because he had reached the place he wanted to be, and that was having nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them.
Right. Someone whose judgment I value a lot on North Korea, Andrei Lankov, who knows North Korea very well, many, many years ago, once described to me the rhythm of North Korea's pressure and negotiating cycle. And he described a phase after tensions peaked and North Korea began to sort of signal that it was actually open to some sort of compromise as milking the cow phase. And maybe this is what the phrase that the North Koreans themselves used. We're entering into a phase where North Korea will seek to extract the concessions, the advantages, the benefits that it can from each partner or party. And as I said before, the ability to go separately to China for certain things, South Korea for other things, plays to North Koreans' advantage. Milk the cow, but then what we should expect, based on the paradigm that I don't think has changed, is that North Korea will begin upping its demands. If you've ever bought anything in Itaewon, you know what the principle of haggling is, which is if the customer is willing to pay retail, you obviously haven't charged him enough. If he hasn't turned his pockets inside out to demonstrate there's no money left, you got to keep going. Yeah. The fact is that not only did President Trump, to paraphrase Robert Gates, buy the same horse, namely to trade a relaxation of pressure for promises, but he paid retail. And it means that we are condemned to seeing an escalation from North Korea if we don't continue to pay up. I don't believe that there is a reasonable prospect of recreating the level of maximum pressure of sanctions implementation that we saw towards the end of 2017. And you need look no further than what the Chinese themselves are saying or what the Chinese are doing in the Sino-North Korean border. It doesn't have to be a de jure lift of sanctions to help Kim Jong-un get to where he wants to be. A combination of the relaxation of enforcement of the black market, gray market along the Dandong, Jilin province area along that border with the investments in Kaesong, a restart of the Kaesong industrial complex or the reopening of the Kumgansan resort, the kind of infrastructure work that President Moon Jae-in has promised, that already represents a huge boost to Kim Jong-un and to North Korea's economy.
So we've talked a lot about the last few days. We've talked about how we got here. You started in your answer just now, Danny, to talk about the way forward, and let's try to do that a bit. If you can stand one more quote, it's a short one. The Economist has just done this really interesting thing where they don't quite know how. It's some Google algorithm or something about statements made by observers immediately after high-stakes summits over the last century. The Cold War summits, post-World War II, everything, and how they hold over time. And they say, in many cases, quote, the historian's eventual verdict was utterly different from that of observers at the time. With that in mind, you're Mike Pompeo, you're John Bolton, which, by the way, it's a whole other story. I mean, what happened to, you know, we were saying before coming out here that the National Security Advisor you would have thought would have been withering in criticism of the sorts of things you're just talking about. But what, we are where we are. What are some of the things that could turn your current pessimism around, I guess? Or put differently, what should Secretary Pompeo be trying to do in the next months or year ahead?
Well, the good news is he is traveling to the region, and he is going to be in Seoul, and Foreign Minister Kono is going to come to Seoul, and there will be a trilateral between South Korea, the United States, and Japan, and he'll also do bilaterals with Foreign Minister Kang and Foreign Minister Kono. So that is good, and then he's going to go to Beijing for consultations as well. And that's critical because clearly we did a lot of things as the United States of America that went our own way, and none of this will work if all the parties are not together, including Russia, quite frankly, for that matter. I expect to see a Putin-Trump summit soon, and I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a Kim-Putin summit in the near future as well. So you've got to keep everybody on side as to what's going on. I would hope that Secretary Pompeo is putting together a first-rate team. Sung Kim, our ambassador in the Philippines, is terrific. He is very capable. He was part of the six-party talks. Randy Shriver from the Defense Department's been at this a long time. A colleague of Richard Armitage's, knows Asia well, knows the Defense Department well. He was part of the team, but their statement that they worked on with Madam Che could only get as far as Pompeo and Kim Young-chol, the head of intelligence from North Korea, sort of gave them parameters to go. So I think they need to broaden that team on the United States side. There need to be some nuclear physicists. There need to be some weapons experts, some arms control experts. The team is not as robust as it needs to be. I suggest they try to spend some days in a room figuring out what they want a final deal to look like. When we were getting very serious about Iran, I asked our team to write an entire agreement.
Yep.
And we sat in a conference room for 2 days and went over about 100 pages, line by line, not because we thought we would get this, but we knew what our instructions were from President Obama. We had to be within that frame. We had to then know what all the pieces of the puzzle that had to be on the table to do it. And it was an incredibly useful way to move forward. The other piece that I think is missing here, just in practical terms of getting down to work, is a timetable for meeting. We have no idea who's going to lead this on the North Korean side. That person was not named. We have no idea if they're going to have a team and who that team would be. We haven't resolved what role South Korea or China or Japan will play in the way forward. So there are a lot of just very practical details if you really want to get a true negotiation underway. The thing that was most missing was besides the verification, was any timetable for what the next step was going to be and how this was going to move forward. And so just very practical things.
And to your point about, a document of the kind that you had your team put together on Iran, surely, I mean, you yourself and many others over the last decades have been involved. It's not like you're starting from scratch, right? I mean, does not, and you have to update it because of the status quo at the moment, but this sort of thing exists, right?
Yeah, things exist. So I want to say this negotiation is much, much harder than Iran, because Iran never had nuclear weapons or ballistic missiles to deliver them. So they had other things that were more difficult. North Korea is sort of a cult So you can encapsulate it in a different way. Iran had trading relationships with lots of people and was a more open system. So it had some difficulties you won't have in the North Korea situation. But profoundly, North Korea has nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them, likely chemical and biological weapons. And so it's a very tough road. And it's going to take time, patience, and persistence. And I'll put in a plug for my book coming out in September, which is called Not for the Faint of Heart, Lessons in Courage, Power, and Persistence. So
come back and do a book event with
Sure.
us, will you? Okay.
Look forward to that, for sure. Well, on the same question, if I could, and also a little product placement, I just posted an article in Foreign Affairs last night, which I argued that going forward, the critical issue is going to be V, not V for victory, but V for verification. So the crucial next step, in my view, is North Korea's making a declaration of what they have, both in terms of their nuclear program, their fissile material, their nuclear facilities, and in terms of their ballistic missile programs. Let's not lose sight of the UN Security Councils as the benchmark. The goal is to bring North Korea into compliance with the provisions of the UN Security Council. So the starting point to any road that could hope to lead to denuclearization, let alone complete, verifiable, and irreversible, is North Korea owning up to what it has. That's the starting point. That has also been the ending point of negotiations with North Korea in the past, which is why it's so important to get at it and to get it right. Step number one has to be North Korea making a declaration, a full declaration of its program. And step 1B then is North Korea's agreement to some credible mechanism for verification, verifying. North Korea won't have given up a single nuke. It won't have given up a single ballistic missile. And let's remember the pause button that it's pressed on its ballistic missile program only applies to ICBMs and to intermediate range ballistic missiles. They said no, not one word about holding off on testing the medium-range ballistic missiles that clearly threaten Japan and South Korea. Moreover, they said nothing about freezing their nuclear research, their nuclear manufacturing, their missile research. This is only limited to a certain number of tests, but be that as it may. Finding out what they say they have, and then getting their agreement and testing their willingness to allow credible international inspectors to look around is the necessary, albeit not sufficient, condition for any hope of moving to denuclearization.
So I want to come to your questions because there are a lot of you, and they're probably going to be better than mine. But confidence-building measures is a term we hear often in these sorts of circumstances. I mean, I imagine it would take quite some time, Danny, for just what you, even though it's not sufficient, but you know, this declaration to come out from the North. Are there things that, if either of you were in the room with Secretary Pompeo or whomever, to say, here's a short menu of things that we would like to see in the aftermath of Singapore that would count as, you know, as confidence-building measures? What might they be?
Okay.
Well, I mean, there's traditional confidence-building measures, the Pyongyang Philharmonic coming to New York, which are all well and good. I think we're not in the touchy-feely stage.
I didn't mean that. I mean
no,
actually on the nuclear front.
No, I think if I were advising Secretary Pompeo, what I would ask for is for him to say to Kim Yong-chol, take one of our expert teams to a nuclear site in North Korea that we've never seen, that has never been declared. We don't want to go to Yongbyon. We want to go somewhere else. Show us a uranium enrichment facility. Start with one place that you haven't owned up to, and let our inspectors take Sig Hecker. Let them in, show them around. Let's get started. Before we get to the issue of the international community taking away your nuclear program or your ballistic missile program. Just give us a peek behind the curtain, because we need to understand what you have in order to, in future, to ascertain whether you've given up 100% or whether you've given up 10%.
One thing I think it's very important for us all to think hard about is that North Korea views this exercise as the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. We view it as the denuclearization of North Korea. And that difference has to be worked through in a way that doesn't completely undermine Kim's confidence in being in this process, while at the same time being very clear that in this way, we are not equals. It is not true that South Korea doesn't have nuclear weapons. Japan doesn't have nuclear weapons. So it's going to be very tricky, because throughout this entire process, it's been crystal clear we have different definitions of what denuclearization is and how that's going to proceed. But I think Danny's suggestion of some very practical, concrete steps leading to the declaration, which is all important, will be crucial. But North Korea is going to say, we need a confidence-building measure that you take, and so lift these sanctions or do these things, and we can't. Because if we start lifting sanctions every time they take us to a new facility, we'll be out of sanctions before we get rid of their nuclear weapons. So it's a very thorny problem that's going to take a lot of thought, how you manage to say to North Korea, no, actually, yes, we don't want nuclear weapons anywhere on the Korean Peninsula. We don't want people to have the capability of getting there, but the main focus of this exercise is the threat that you pose to South Korea, Japan, and to the world, and to the United States. So,
could I just build on the very, very important point that Wendy has just made, which is what we should expect from the North Koreans in the effort to define the meaning of complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula isn't a geographic definition. The North Koreans will argue that the U.S. nuclear umbrella, the ability of Tomahawk missiles, of nuclear-capable submarines, of strike aircraft that are stationed in Japan or in Guam or even on the continental United States, the ability to strike North Korea constitutes the U.S. nuclearization. Kim Jong-un, if you read some of the commentary coming out of North Korea, has talked about global denuclearization in terms that remind me vividly of the speech that President Obama gave in Prague in 2009. This is a contribution to the welfare of mankind that Kim Jong-un is willing to make. But he's taking that classic tactic of expanding the problem, of approaching denuclearization as a much bigger issue, so as to ensure that the focus won't be tightly centered around North Korea's own nuclear program.
Okay. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. If we can get the mics. John, if you don't mind getting me the ones from the internet, and we'll get going. Why don't we start up front? Oh, boy. Yes, gentleman here, and then when you're done, sir, pass the mic to the gentleman to your left. But we'll start with you. And you can just say who you are.
Okay.
And
I'm Larry Ackman. I am a resident of New York City. I'm not in the diplomatic community whatsoever. But I don't see how these negotiations can ever be successful, because you have an American leader who is not trustworthy, and you have a Korean leader who has proven not to be trustworthy, and you have a Senate in the United States that wants to do this as a treaty, and because they don't trust the president. So when you have no element of trust, is there any precedent in the past for a successful end to these negotiations?
any optimism from the gentleman?
Negotiations are not about trust, ever. They might be about respect, but they're not about trust. Because, you know,
if there were trust,
you would be able to work things out quite easily. So I've never trusted the Iranians. I've never trusted the North Koreans. I have some respect for the Iranians. Haven't quite gotten to respect for the North Koreans yet. But it isn't about trust. You're quite right about your analysis. There is none around at the moment. But that doesn't mean you can't find a way there. I don't want to sugarcoat this, though. This is really, really hard, which is why I don't think our government's quite organized in the right way to take this on, because it is tough for the reasons you say, and then for very substantive reasons as well. So I do think it's possible, but I don't know if we'll ever get there. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think the equation is success in negotiations equals leverage plus compromise, and maybe there's a little creativity in that equation as well. The problem that we're already beginning to see, which I recognize in the to me a mystery between the fact that, as Ambassador Sherman said, Sung Kim is a really talented and a vastly experienced negotiator. He knows the North Korean counterpart, Chae Sung-wi, extremely well. He's been around the track again and again. And despite his best efforts over 2+ weeks in Panmunjom, if the Singapore joint statement, which, as Ambassador Sherman pointed out, it represents sort of a very weak version of bits and pieces of prior agreements, is the best that he could do, there's got to be a reason. And I think part of that reason is the handicap that, as she said, he couldn't go any further than the outer limits of the parameters set by Secretary Pompeo and Kim Yong-chol. Well, guess what? Going forward in negotiations, Secretary Pompeo isn't going to be able to go any further than the parameters set by the president. And the character of what the president has done is to personalize the negotiations and to pursue the kind of heroic style of diplomacy, a one-man style. The fact that what President Trump has said and agreed to in Singapore is so dramatically less than what his advisors, including and particularly Secretary Pompeo, said they were going after, I think suggests that the North Koreans have little incentive to make compromises to Secretary Pompeo as long as they believe that in the Mar-a-Lago summit or the Oval Office summit, or you heard it here, maybe not first, the Pyongyang summit, which is coming, they're going to be able to get a vastly better deal. And just look at human rights. President Trump, there's a brilliant headline in a piece by Mike Green this morning that says, President Trump issues another celebrity pardon, this time of Kim Jong-un. Because if you read an interview he gave early this morning, he explains away North Korea's human rights record as, well, he's a little rough, but he's really a very good guy. He liked me. That's a direct quote.
Right. If you haven't listened or watched the Greta Van Susteren interview with Trump for Voice of America, it's just breathtaking.
Yeah. Sir?
I'm totally persuaded by this discussion that this is going to end very badly. My question is focusing on domestic politics. How long do you think it will take before it's apparent that the president's given up all this candy and he's not going to get complete denuclearization, much less extensive verification?
It goes to the question, when are we going to know, really?
I think it's going to be in everybody's interest to play along for quite some time, because people don't want to return to fire and fury. People don't want to return to the specter of war. So if the freeze stays on, the testing, I think people will string this out for quite some time. I think it is, looking at the midterm elections, it is in the president's interest and the Republicans' interest to say, you know, we are engaged, this is important, we're not at war, people said this is going to be a disaster, we're doing well, it's hard, it's difficult, we've got to give it time, because it's part of the narrative of getting through the midterms in a better place than Republicans are right now. For Democrats, Democrats are in a tough position. You can't say you aren't for negotiations because that means you return to war. It's not like there are lots of alternatives here. Yes, you can amp up the pressure. So what Democrats, I think, have to do is support this effort at diplomacy and dialogue, lay out the terms for what success is, and then ask at appropriate times about the pace of making progress toward it. But I think there is a collective interest in playing along for quite some time.
Lulu, we'll go to the women now. Lulu and then Inger. Yeah.
Thank you. I was just thinking about Trump's tactics here. Could there be any parallel drawn from this first engagement with Kim, similar to his first engagement with President Xi, where he goes for the buddy-buddy optics, and in this case, buddy-buddy, but also thumbing his nose at his allies whom he just snubbed in Canada. And then after setting up the buddy-buddy, which he's done with all the other leaders, Macron, with Trudeau, with Xi, and then winning the visibility, and then going back to the drawing boards with maybe some wiser counsel, and finding out what he should truly extract from this new buddy. Could this be a path?
Yeah, I think that's very perceptive. There is a method to President Trump's approach. There's a pattern, and I think Xi Jinping perhaps is the closest analogy to an engagement with an authoritarian Asian leader like Kim Jong-un. But let's look at how that's worked out. I was still in government when the Mar-a-Lago visit was being planned, and I have tire tracks on my back from arguing that it was a mistake and I thought a squandering of our leverage, to give the Chinese leader something he very much wanted, an early visit to the United States with all the political benefits associated with that, without linking it to our substantive objectives, making it the culmination of a negotiating process. But the approach that the president took, and I think it is true in the case of Kim Jong-un as well, is step number one is establish a personal relationship. Looking at the China model, step number two is unleashing the attack dogs to go after the opponent over specific issues like the trade deficit, like forced transfer of technology, like South China Sea or coddling North Korea. The China model would suggest that in dealing with an authoritarian socialist leader, it doesn't work. If it didn't work with Xi Jinping, if the beautiful chocolate cake at Mar-a-Lago, if the bromance didn't cause Xi Jinping to set aside the China dream, set aside the Made in China 2025 industrial strategy, and chop $200 billion off the trade deficit, if it didn't work with China, with whom the United States has immense areas of service contact and overlap, we're deeply integrated. If it didn't work with China, it is certainly not going to work with Kim Jong-un.
Inger Elliott, and then we're going to go to the back of the room if we can, a little bit. Not to say we won't come back.
Thank you. What I don't quite understand, and with all these descriptions, there was a book by a man called Ignazio Saloni in the 1930s. He wrote a book called School for Dictators, basically describing Mussolini. And what I don't understand is why we're really not describing our current president, and not even calling him president, as a person who is a dictator. And he's been dictating all our, I shouldn't say all, but a lot of our policies. And we're trying to figure out how, as a democracy, we get rid of that.
Well, I'm not going to take that.
Well,
Go ahead. I'll say
one quick question. The United States has very, very strong institutions. They are resilient, and they are populated by real people, men and women who are dedicated to the Republic, dedicated to our values, dedicated to the common good. And that's an essential component of our national structure. The that is one of the reasons why I think that the cavalier promise that President Trump made in Singapore to abandon U.S. ROK defensive joint exercises without any meaningful concession on the North Koreans' part, let alone a reciprocal agreement to cancel their equivalent exercises, will not ultimately stand. And there are other examples in other fields where we have seen the president walked back on a bold and dispositive declaration by our institutions, whether they were the law enforcement or the military or the diplomatic and national security entities. So don't lose faith.
And I would agree with the resilience. So in the long term, I think we will be back. But I do share your concern in the short term, medium term, at the damage that's being done. I came of political age, as probably many of you in the room did, in the 60s. It was an incredibly violent time, 5 assassinations, the Vietnam War, Kent State, a lot of violence. We came through that and came to a Civil Rights Act, a Voting Rights Act, the women's movement, the end of the Vietnam War, but a lot of people got hurt in the process. And so for me, that is, I believe we will come out the other side because I share the concern about where we are at this moment. But it means everybody has to engage, and citizens have to take responsibility for holding government and elected officials accountable, and that's our power.
Well said. Oh boy. Thank you. And where's the person with the mic? The gentleman in front of the camera there. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Hiroshi with Fuji TV. I was wondering if I can get your thoughts on Japanese abductees. As President Trump was talking, he brought up the issue at the summit, and I was wondering, do you think this issue would be able, the United States and DPRK will be able to solve this, or do you think only Japan will have to do this by themselves with the DPRK?
I believe, as we have done in the past, that this should be an issue that's on the table by all parties who meet with North Korea. I think when it comes to abductees, I feel as I do about any citizen taken hostage or detained by a government. It's interest to raise those issues because it could happen to us next. And so if we do it collectively, we're much more likely to get a reaction and an impact. The president said he raised the issue. I hope he did. And I think Japan, certainly as this goes forward, will have to play more of a role in the process. But that's been difficult because of what North Korea's permitted. But we all remember famously when Koizumi went to Pyongyang to talk about abductees, people thought there might be some traction. There was for a little while, and then it disappeared. This is one of the issues that will have to be resolved if we can come to an adequate resolution of our concerns with North Korea.
Just to take a quick one from online, what is ideally suited for you, Ambassador Sherman? What impact, if any, did the U.S. withdrawal from the Iran deal have on negotiations with North Korea?
You know, the president thinks that his withdrawal from the Iran deal, just as he believes his going on the offense with the G7, shows that he is strong and tough and that he won't settle for less than what he asks for. I don't share that. I think that it makes him look weak, and I think it makes him look unreliable and without credibility. And even if North Korea doesn't care, South Korea and Japan look at that behavior and say, is this really an alliance? Is this really somebody I can count on? So I think it hurts the president for what he wants to accomplish. He doesn't appear to agree with me. The one last thing I'll say is I find it interesting that now that we're at this place, all of a sudden for some people the Iran deal's looking pretty good. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Republicans were on the air over the last 2 days saying Secretary Pompeo should begin by looking at the Iran deal. So
Really?
I'm all for it.
Oh, my goodness. Okay. Yes, sir. Yep.
Thank you for a great presentation. My name is Robert Bildner from New York. Ambassador Sherman, you referred to your, I guess, when the pulling out of this summit and then the going back to the summit, and then I think you suggested that we didn't really pull out. And then when your conclusion that the declaration is very thin, which I totally agree with. Could you flesh that out a little bit more, like what happened and kind of how did we get to this spot of essentially acceding to the North Korean demands, which I agree. They seem to have taken a lot. We haven't got much from it, but something happened in between, and it's just not clear.
Well, I think Danny's using Tom Pickering's theory is quite right. If you want something so badly, you end up with something bad. So the president wanted this summit. He thought it would make history. He saw it as a way to get in front of a very tough problem and create momentum going into the midterms as a great foreign policy leader. And look, we had 2 days where there was very little Mueller discussion on television. It was completely dominated by the summit. So that's all a plus for the president. And so I think that his letter, which he certainly was all him, that he sent saying, I'm not going to do this, all the logistical negotiations, all of the substantive negotiations never stopped. It never stopped. So everybody was into theater. The North was into theater. We were into theater. But both the president and Kim Jong-un wanted to get to this summit. And I made a comment, I forget where, that it's bizarre, but it may be that Kim Jong-un's interests and Donald Trump's interests align. Kim Jong-un wants to stay in power. He needs to open up a little for that to happen and really produce for the North Korean people. Donald Trump wants to get through the midterms in a better place and get reelected in 2020. This is a really tough and thorny problem. If he can show that he's on top of it, in charge of it, not afraid of it, it gives him and the Republican Party some lift that they badly need.
To the front row then, here.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Just a question. I wanted to ask if you think the outcome of the summit will strengthen Kim Jong-un also on the domestic front and in his relations with China.
Well, it's a very interesting question, and I think all of us saw the apparent purge of 3 top KPA, North Korean Army officers, just a week or so before the Singapore summit, and it raises questions and might be a clue that tends to support a thesis held by some that Kim Jong-un is meeting with certain resistance within parts of his national security, his own national security establishment, who are wary of this engagement with the U.S. It's very, very speculative, but after all, dictators have politics too, to a degree. But I think that when you review the outcome of the Singapore summit, which from the North Korean perspective vastly outstripped what must have been even their wildest ambition, Kim Jong-un has to have returned to Pyongyang as a conquering hero. And look no further than the front page of Nodong Shinmun to see just this glorious pastiche of photos of Kim being treated as a peer by the President of the United States, just like Mao was, just like Gorbachev was, something that his father and even Kim Il-sung lusted after but could never achieve. On top of that, when you look at the joint statement, vague retrograde language about kind of sort of denuclearization, language about the U.S. North Korean relationship based on absolute equality. Talk about a peace arrangement, peace treaty. And importantly, the agreement to resume the MIA remains recovery program, something that North Korea wants, and particularly the Korean People's Army wants, because it is a huge moneymaker. Let's be clear about it, they sell bones to the U.S. military for millions of dollars. It is not a humanitarian mission. It's a money-making operation for the KPA. This is something that the Army wanted. So when the military leaders look at what Kim Jong-un got in Singapore, not to mention the special bonus prize of a unilateral agreement to stop, not just stop U.S. ROK joint defensive exercises, but to stop the provocative war games, which incidentally cost a lot of money. It's breathtaking. You've got to believe that Kim Jong-un returned to Pyongyang in a vastly stronger position. China is a different matter. It's an immensely complicated relationship, but as Ambassador Sherman rightly pointed out, an agreement that sets the stage for the reduction of U.S. military operations in East Asia, and stay tuned, the demand for the withdrawal of THAAD batteries and so on, that halts U.S. ROK exercises, that begins fragmenting the alliance, that cuts Japan loose and leaves it as an isolated outlier. That's got to be music to the ears of the People's Liberation Army.
All of us have to keep in mind all of the time that as much as this is a negotiation about the North's nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, it's also about who controls the future of Asia and Northeast Asia, and who is the United States as a Pacific power as well as an Atlantic power going to keep its stake in Asia and where it's headed. And I think that the president doesn't fully understand that our troops being there, our presence being there, has a much larger purpose than just as a deterrent against North Korea's conventional army, which it certainly is. So it is, there seems to be a lens that's way too narrow here in how the president's proceeding.
Sorry, could I just have one alibi? There is a underreported, but I think profoundly important statement that President Trump made on June 1st in the South Lawn immediately after his meeting with North Korean envoy Kim Yong-chol, in which he said, apropos of economic assistance and why he had no intention of having to pay for that himself, that, remember, North Korea, East Asia, this is not our neighborhood. It's 6,000 miles away. It's not our neighborhood. And an echo of that was heard in his Singapore press availability when he said, it's not part of this deal, but I want to bring those boys, I want to bring our troops home. Taken against the backdrop of what he has said repeatedly about our allies being free riders, the experience at the NATO summit, et cetera, I think we have a significant and troubling clue to where he may be pointing.
So from the sublime to the somewhat, I don't know, ridiculous, or pick your adjective, there's a question you may not be able to answer because I don't know. Have you seen the video that was produced?
I have.
Yeah. The folks here know what I'm talking about. So if you didn't, there was a 4-minute or so short film produced that the White House, that the president, I guess, gave to his North Korean counterpart, which is called What If, with this fictional company called Destiny Pictures. It's like a movie trailer for what North Korea could look like in the future. So we have a question, just what's your impression of the video that was made? That's a very open one. I don't think, Danny, you've seen it, have you?
You know, interesting gimmick. I don't think it added much to what went on, and it fuels the president's general posture, which is any place where you could have a beautiful condo and a hotel is worth discussing. And, you know, quite frankly, that's just not Kim Jong-un's first priority. So I get why they did it. They were looking for, you know, an icebreaker, so to speak, and to try to say, you know, I can invest here too. But I don't think it achieved very much.
It's a really, you know, you should take 4 minutes to look at it. It's kind of interesting. Monik, is that you? Yeah, in the front and in the back. We have time for just a couple more.
Thank you. My name is Manik Mehta. I'm a syndicated journalist. My question to both of you would be about the impact of the summit on Iran and also on the Europeans who support the Iran deal. What do you think about it?
Impact on Iran and Europeans who supported the deal.
Yeah, I think, you know, right around the time of this, right before the summit, Iran was at the, why am I blocking on the regional organization that Russia and China are sort of driving for East Asia? SCO. Thank you, SCO. In hopes of wanting to become part of SCO. And Iran is, Foreign Minister Zarif is traveling everywhere as is Rouhani, to say, you know, we are a player. So from everywhere from India to China to Europe, they've really been moving around, Latin America as well. So I think that they will hope that this makes the Iran deal look better. They, however, have already sort of made their geopolitical decision, and that is to forget about the U.S. for now. The president thinks that Iran will come begging because of our economic sanctions, which are exceedingly powerful. Our secondary economic sanctions are very, very powerful because if anyone wants to do business with a U.S. bank and they aren't paying attention to the sanctions, they can't do business with a U.S. bank. And we are the world's reserve currency. That makes us very powerful. Oil is traded in dollars. That makes us very powerful. One of the things that Secretary of Treasury Jack Lew often said is, let's use these secondary sanctions very carefully because when we use them, after a while, people are going to say, to hell with the U.S. dollar being the world's reserve currency. Let's build a basket, or let's go look at the euro or the yuan, because the U.S. is using their position unfairly to the rest of the world. That's incredibly dangerous for the U.S. economy. So we have to do this carefully. So I think the Iranians are going to look elsewhere. They're not going to come with their tail between their legs back to the negotiating table with President Trump. That's not going to happen.
So it's not true they're in Tehran, they're working on a 4-minute video showing real estate opportunities in Tehran?
Don't think so.
Who knows? One more. Yeah, Daniel, and then I think we got to wrap. If you can wait for the mic, please.
Danny, can you talk a little bit more about Japan cut loose, I believe, were your words. And when you put it in the context of the point Lulu raised about the G7 bust-up, Abe was there as well. If you're Abe personally and if you're the Japan policy community more generally, where do you go from here?
Well, it's an important question. Look, the most valuable asset in America's portfolio is the faith of our partners in America's security commitments and America's determination to defend not U.S. values but universal values. and actions that shake the confidence of our partners and our allies, both in our fidelity to the principle of prior consultation, or to the credibility of our deterrence and the alliance commitments, really weakens the foundation of American influence, American power, and I think, therefore, American security. The Trump administration early on, not the president himself, was fond of saying that America first doesn't mean America alone. But what we've seen recently is a succession of decisions and actions that were frankly taken alone despite the valiant efforts by Prime Minister Abe to promote and to ensure coordination, his multiple visits to the United States, his dogged efforts to try to inform and persuade and to caution President Trump when it came to how to deal with the DPRK. Whatever you think of his style, there's no longer much evidence that it has had the kind of impact that clearly he sought to have in terms of ensuring a seamless bond between allies, a collective approach. And for Japan, which is on the receiving end of a very deliberate North Korean strategy to vilify Japan, to isolate Japan, to hold Japan at arm's length for the purpose, I think, of extorting it later on. I think the North Koreans want to save Japan for dessert. They're collecting from Washington, they're collecting from Seoul, they're collecting from Beijing. As Ambassador Sherman said, they're about to collect from Moscow. But the big payoff in dollar terms or in yen terms is going to be reparations from Japan. It's going to be multi-billion dollar deal. And I think we're in a stage where the North Koreans are seeking to soften up Japan. The bigger issue and the bigger threat is that if American deterrence isn't credible, if American security guarantees and alliances can flip on a dime because we think it's too expensive, because we want to bring our troops home, because we're going to go for a quick fix, sugar high deal rather than keep to our interests and our principles, then countries like Japan, but not limited to Japan, have nowhere to go but to strike out on their own. And that means develop their own independent strike capabilities.
Okay, I'm afraid our time is up. Just as a parting word, I frankly feel like, I don't remember the quote anymore, but I want to come back to that economist thing and hope that the historians will someday say that these two observers were wrong. I have my doubts, but because they've been great, but my own endorphins may suffer. Ambassador Wendy Sherman, Daniel Russel, thank you so much. Thank you all for being with us this morning. Thank you so much.
Sure.